All came on a Tuesday. That's the detail I keep coming back to, not a Monday when bad news at least has the decency to arrive with the week. Tuesday. Like the company couldn't even wait 48 hours before deciding to rearrange my life. My name is not important. What matters is that I have been with Halverson & Crane for 22 years. 22 years of quarterly audits, client renewals, and budget cycles that I could run in my sleep. I started as a junior analyst when the firm had one office in Cincinnati and a client list you could print on 2 pages. By the time this story happened, we had 7 regional offices, a government contracts division, and a reputation in federal infrastructure financing that most firms spend decades trying to build. I helped build it, not alone, but I was there for every brick. My background was the Army Corps of Engineers. 6 years. I learned how to read a project the way a doctor reads an X-ray, not just what's visible, but what the shadow behind it means. That discipline never left me. When I came into private finance, I brought that same instinct. Slow down, look twice, ask the question nobody wants to ask. It made me unpopular in certain rooms. It made the firm money in every room that mattered. I was 53. And I was about to watch a 29-year-old with a business school degree and a LinkedIn profile walk into my office and put his name on my door. His name was Corbin Hashby, the managing partner's nephew. He had done 2 years at a boutique advisory firm in Chicago. 2 years before his uncle decided that Halverson & Crane needed fresh strategic energy. That phrase, I heard it in a staff meeting and I had to set my pen down because my hand was shaking slightly and I didn't want anyone to see it. Fresh strategic energy. I had 37 active client accounts. I had managed the federal compliance review that kept this firm's government contracts license clean for 4 consecutive cycles. I had mentored 11 analysts who had gone on to senior roles, 2 of whom were now managing directors at competitor firms and still called me when they hit something they didn't understand. Fresh strategic energy. I didn't say anything in that meeting. I wrote the phrase down on the notepad in front of me, and I circled it once. Then I put my pen in my pocket, and I listened. The plan, as presented by my managing partner, I'll call him Whitfield because he had that kind of last name energy, was that Corbin would come in as Director of Strategic Development, new title, new role. Technically parallel to mine. That was how Whitfield framed it. Parallel. Not above, not replacing, parallel. I knew what parallel meant. I had been in enough reorganizations to know that parallel is where they park you before they move you out. What I didn't know yet was that Corbin had already been given my office. I found out the way you find out about things like that, not from a conversation, but from a physical fact. I came in at 7 on a Wednesday, coffee in hand, and my keycard didn't work on the door to my office. I stood there for a moment, genuinely confused. I tried it again. Nothing. I walked down to the front desk and the receptionist, a young woman who had the misfortune of being the first person I encountered, told me with obvious discomfort that there had been a space reassignment. My new office was on the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor. I had been on the 2nd floor for 11 years. Corner office. Not a corner for status. A corner because the light was good and I could see the parking structure, and I always knew which clients had arrived before I got the call from reception. Small things. But mine, my new office on the 3rd floor, was an interior room. No windows. It had been used for storage until approximately 48 hours earlier. There were still faint rectangles on the carpet where filing cabinets had stood. I set my coffee on the desk, a smaller desk I noticed, and I sat down and I looked at the wall for about 30 seconds. Then I opened my laptop and I started working. Here is what I did not do. I did not go to Whitfield's office and demand an explanation. I did not send an angry email. I did not call a colleague to vent. I had learned in the army that the moment you let someone know they've gotten to you is the moment you hand them the next move. I was not going to hand Corbin Ashby or Whitfield or anyone else the next move. What I did instead was get very quiet and very organized. I had 3 things that Corbin did not have, and those 3 things were going to matter before this was finished. The first was institutional knowledge. I knew where every body was buried in this firm's history, not metaphorically, literally. I knew which client relationships were genuinely solid and which were held together by one personal connection that could evaporate the moment that person changed jobs. I knew which contracts had language in them that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. I knew the actual payment behavior of every major account versus what was reported in the CRM. The second was relationships, not LinkedIn connections. Actual relationships. People who answered when I called. My counterpart at the Army Corps, a man named Bernard, who had been my CO's logistics officer 20 years ago and had since moved into federal procurement oversight. My contact at the State Infrastructure Authority, a woman I'd worked with on 3 bond issuances over 15 years, who trusted my read on projects more than she trusted her own staff's analysis. These weren't people Corbin could walk in and inherit. You can't inherit relationships. You earn them or you don't have them. The third thing I had was a file. I'm going to come back to that. The first month, Corbin operated the way people like Corbin always operate in the beginning. He called meetings. He introduced himself to clients over lunches that he charged to the firm. He used words like ecosystem and value architecture in presentations that said very little and sounded very good. I sat in 2 of those presentations and watched the room. Some people were nodding. Some people were doing what I had learned to do, writing things down so they didn't have to make eye contact with what was happening. He was not stupid. I want to be fair about that. He was smart in a particular way. He could read a room. He knew which executive to flatter and how. He had a kind of social fluency that I had never possessed and genuinely admired, even then. Even as I was watching him operate in the office I had occupied for 11 years. But there's a difference between knowing how to work a room and knowing how to work a deal. That difference was going to become relevant. In the 3rd week, Corbin made his first move on my accounts. He called it a client experience refresh. The idea was that certain accounts, specifically the 3 largest federal contracts in my portfolio, would be transitioned to joint management, him and me, together. He framed it in a meeting with Whitfield as collaboration, building bridges between the old operational approach and the new strategic vision. I said, I think that makes sense. Let me put together a transition briefing so Corbin has full context on each account. Whitfield looked surprised. He had expected pushback. I could see it in the way he'd arranged his face before I spoke, ready to manage me. When I agreed instead, he didn't quite know what to do with himself. I went back to my windowless office on the 3rd floor and I wrote the most thorough transition briefing I had ever produced. 61 pages. Every account, every relationship, every nuance in the contracts, every piece of context that mattered. I sent it to Corbin and Whitfield on a Friday afternoon. Corbin sent back a 2-line reply. Great stuff. Really comprehensive. Let's connect next week. He never read it. I knew he never read it because 3 days later, he made a comment in a client call that revealed he didn't know something that was on page 4 of the briefing. I didn't correct him on the call. I made a note. I want to tell you about the file now, because it's the thing that changed everything, and I want to be precise about how it came to exist. 8 months before Corbin arrived, I had been doing a routine review of our federal contract compliance documentation. We were up for renewal on an infrastructure financing arrangement with a regional transit authority, a contract worth approximately $18 million over 3 years. Standard renewal. I had done it twice before. During the review, I found something. A discrepancy. The project deliverable reporting that had been submitted to the transit authority for the previous cycle included numbers that didn't match the internal project files. Not by a little, by enough that if someone at the authority had looked carefully, it would have raised questions. The kind of questions that, in federal contracting, don't get answered quietly. They get answered with audits and, depending on what the audit finds, with referrals. I had flagged it internally. I had written a memo to Whitfield. His response had been to have a brief conversation with me in which he explained that the discrepancy was a formatting issue that had since been internally reconciled. He used the phrase, "Let's not create problems where there aren't any." I wrote that down too. I kept copies of everything. The original submitted reports. The internal files. My memo. Whitfield's verbal response, documented in a note I wrote immediately after our conversation and timestamped. The reconciliation documents, which, when I looked at them carefully, did not actually reconcile anything. They just added a layer of paper on top of the discrepancy. I had kept all of this in a folder on an external drive that lived in my briefcase, not on the company server. I had kept it because I was not sure what I was going to do with it, and I knew that being uncertain was not the same as being unprepared. Now I was becoming more certain. The moment that crystallized it for me happened 6 weeks after Corbin arrived. I came in on a Monday morning and found that my access to the federal contracts management system had been restricted, not removed, restricted. I could read files, but I could no longer update them. I called IT. They told me the permissions change had come from Whitfield's office. I sent Whitfield an email asking about the access change. He replied that as part of the strategic restructuring, primary system access for the federal portfolio had been centralized under Corbin's login credentials for efficiency purposes. I read that email twice. Then I forwarded it to my personal email, added it to the file, and picked up the phone. The person I called was not a lawyer. Not yet. It was Bernard, my old contact at the Army Corps, now in federal procurement oversight. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about what I had found, not directly. We talked about compliance standards, about how transit authority contracts were reviewed, about what kinds of discrepancies triggered mandatory reporting requirements at the federal level. Bernard, without knowing the specifics of my situation, gave me a very clear picture of the landscape. When I hung up, I understood something precisely. What I had in that file was not just leverage, it was a regulatory obligation. If those discrepancies were what I believed they were, there were reporting requirements that applied regardless of what Whitfield wanted, regardless of what was convenient, regardless of what happened to my career. I had been sitting on this for 8 months because I had hoped the firm would address it internally. That hope was gone. I called a lawyer that afternoon, not someone in the firm's network, someone I found independently. A woman who specialized in federal contractor compliance and whistleblower matters. I drove to her office the next morning before work. I brought the file. She looked at it for 20 minutes while I sat across from her. When she looked up, she said, "This is not a small thing." I said, "I know." She said, "You understand that once you report this, you can't unreport it." I said, "I've been in situations where there's only one direction worth moving. This is one of those." She filed the disclosure on my behalf to the Federal Transit Authority's Inspector General's office 12 days later. I had spent those 12 days making sure everything was documented, organized, and submitted through the correct channels with the correct protections in place. I had also, quietly, begun speaking with 2 of my largest clients directly, not about the firm's problems, but about continuity planning, about my own availability, about what a transition in their advisory relationships might look like. I did not tell Whitfield. I did not tell Corbin. I went to work every morning. I sat in meetings. I answered emails. I drank coffee at my small desk in my windowless office, and I waited. The investigator from the Inspector General's office made first contact with Halverson and Crane on a Thursday morning. I know it was a Thursday because I was in a budget review meeting when Whitfield's assistant came to the door and said he was needed immediately. Whitfield left without a word. He did not come back to that meeting. By noon, the firm's outside counsel had been contacted. I know this because a colleague who had no idea what was happening mentioned it in the break room. "Some kind of federal inquiry," she said, and then looked at her coffee like she wished she hadn't said anything. I finished my lunch at my desk. I sent 2 client emails. I did not check my personal phone until 5 o'clock when I had a message from my attorney saying the IG's office had confirmed receipt and begun preliminary review. What happened over the next 3 weeks was not dramatic in the way that things are dramatic in movies. There were no confrontations in hallways. No one called me into a room and accused me of anything. What happened was quieter and more thorough than that. Federal investigators are not theatrical people. They ask for documents. They ask for more documents. They ask for more documents. They follow the paper trail with a patience that private firms never have, because private firms are always running against a quarterly calendar, and investigators are running against the truth, which has its own schedule. The Transit Authority suspended contract renewal discussions pending the outcome of the review. $18 million, frozen. 2 other clients, the ones I had spoken to quietly about continuity planning, reached out to ask about my availability independently. One of them was a county infrastructure authority that I had worked with for 9 years. Their deputy director called me directly and said, "I don't know what's happening over there, but I know what I know about you. Whatever you're doing next, I want to be part of that conversation." That call came on a Friday afternoon. I was still sitting in my windowless office with the carpet rectangles. I looked at the wall after I hung up, and I thought about the Tuesday when I couldn't open my own door. Corbin resigned 4 weeks after the investigation began. I heard it third hand through a colleague, the way you hear most things that happen in offices. He issued a statement to staff. I never saw it and was gone by end of week. Whitfield followed 6 days later to pursue other opportunities, which is what it says when the other opportunities involve hiring a defense attorney. I was offered my old office back, not by Whitfield, who was gone, but by the firm's general counsel, a man named Everett, who had been brought in by the board to manage the situation. He called me into a conference room and across a table that felt deliberately neutral. He told me the board wanted to express its appreciation for my years of service and its desire to stabilize the firm's operations going forward. I let him finish. Then I said, "I appreciate that. I'd like to talk about what stabilization actually looks like." We talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, I had an agreement, interim managing director of federal contracts, pending a formal search, with the understanding that my name would be in that search. Full restoration of system access, and a quiet settlement that I'm not going to detail here because that's between me and my attorney. I took the office back, not because I needed the window. I had gotten used to the 3rd floor, honestly, in the way that you can get used to anything when you're focused. I took it because it mattered to get it back. There's a difference between not needing something and being willing to let someone take it. My old army officer's coin collection was still in the bottom drawer of my desk. Corbin had never touched it, apparently. Either he didn't notice it, or he didn't care about it either way, which tells you something about the kind of presence he was in that space. I put the collection back on the corner of my desk where it had always been. 7 coins, from different postings, different people, different moments that meant something. I looked at them for a minute before I started my first email as interim managing director. The coin on top was from Bernard, actually. He'd given it to me years ago, a challenge coin from his unit, after we'd worked together on a particularly complicated federal project that almost fell apart 3 times before it didn't. He'd said when he gave it to me, "The thing about complicated is it doesn't scare the right people. It only scares the ones who shouldn't be there." I thought about that a lot those last few weeks. You know what the hardest part was? Not the windowless office. Not windowless office. Not watching Corbin work my accounts with his ecosystem language and his value architecture. Not even the access restriction, which was the most insulting of the operational moves. The hardest part was the morning I sat at that small desk on the 3rd floor and wondered, for about 45 minutes, if I was wrong. Not about the file. I was never uncertain about the file. But about myself, about whether 22 years of building something meant what I thought it meant, whether experience could actually lose to performance, whether being right, quietly and patiently and without drama, was enough. I've talked to a lot of people since this happened, people who went through versions of this same thing. The colleague replaced by a nephew, the 30-year department head moved to a special projects role. The person who built the client relationships that now appear on someone else's LinkedIn profile. What I keep hearing is that the moment that gets them is not the insult. It's the doubt. The moment you start wondering if maybe they're right about you. I'm not going to tell you that doubt goes away. I'm going to tell you that doubt is different from being wrong. I was not wrong, and I had the receipts. What I'd tell anyone who finds themselves in a similar place is this. Don't confuse being quiet for being passive. Don't confuse patience for acceptance. There are moments in any difficult situation where making noise gives the other side information they don't deserve to have. Information about your plan. Information about your fear. Silence is not weakness. Silence is not weakness. Silence is sometimes the most powerful instrument available to you. Corbin Ashby had the office. He had the title. He had the CRM access and the client lunch budget and the managing partner's blessing. I had 22 years, a file, and the ability to wait. Turns out that was enough. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that story, not the legal part, the human part. What causes a person to walk into someone else's 22 years and assume it's available for the taking? I think Corbin genuinely believed that confidence was the same thing as capability. That's not a character flaw unique to him. It's something the professional world accidentally teaches people when it rewards presentation over substance for long enough. He had been rewarded. He had learned the wrong lesson, and then he walked into an environment where the rewards were governed by something older and less forgiving than a performance review, by federal law, by client trust built over decades, by institutional knowledge that doesn't transfer through a briefing document, no matter how thorough it is. That's not bad luck. That's cause and effect, playing out slowly. What I keep returning to is the question of integrity. Not integrity as a concept. Integrity as a daily practice. I kept that file for 8 months before I used it. 8 months of going to work in that windowless office, of sitting in meetings where my access had been stripped, of watching Corbin use language I'd never used to describe work I'd spent 22 years building. 8 months of knowing what I knew and choosing not to use it impulsively. That restraint wasn't patience for its own sake. It was the recognition that acting from anger produces a different outcome than acting from clarity. I wanted to be right, not just loud. There's a version of the story where I walk into Whitfield's office in week 2 and make accusations and get managed out quietly before anything can be verified. I knew that version existed. I chose a different one, the intelligence part, and I don't mean book intelligence. I mean situational intelligence, was understanding what I actually had versus what I felt. What I felt was disrespected. What I had was a documented regulatory discrepancy with time-stamped evidence and a clear legal reporting pathway. Those are different things. Acting on feeling without evidence is just noise. Acting on evidence with the right support structure behind it is something else entirely. Bernard used to say that complicated situations don't scare the right people. They only scare the ones who shouldn't be there. I've tested that observation over a long career, and I believe it's true. Complexity is a filter. The people who can navigate it, not because they're the loudest or the most credentialed, but because they've done the work to understand it. Those people tend to still be standing when the simpler approaches have run out of room. Corbin ran out of room. Whitfield ran out of room. Whitfield ran out of room. The system they were operating in required a level of competence they hadn't built and couldn't borrow. I'm not telling this story to settle a score. Corbin is somewhere building a new version of his career, and that's his to work out. Whitfield is dealing with whatever consequences came from decisions he made before I ever entered the picture. What they did or didn't deserve isn't something I spend much time calculating. What I spend time thinking about is what I almost let them take from me. Not the office, not the accounts, the belief that 22 years of careful, honest work meant something. That's the thing that almost went. That's the thing worth protecting. If you've ever sat in the equivalent of that windowless office and wondered whether the doubt is telling you something true, I want to be clear with you. Doubt and being wrong are not the same thing. One is a feeling, the other is a fact. Check the facts before you believe the feeling. That's the whole lesson, really. Everything else is just the story around it.